hopefully. There we go. Good morning, everybody. My name is Morgan Denny here in Portland, Oregon. I teach the primary care physical therapy course and also the PT management of the post-COVID patient online course. So today, before we get started, I just want to say I am stoked that in about 2 weeks, I will be back in Nebraska. Go Bug Eaters! Teaching with Justin for total spine thrust manipulation. We'll be in North Platte, which is the other end of the state where I'm from, but I'm stoked to be back in the Midwest, so that should be super fun. And then Sampler is coming up. So for any of you going to ICE Sampler the last weekend in March, I will be excited to see you all there. I also, would be silly not to announce, or at least remind everyone, that the PT management of the post-COVID patient online course is ready and available. It is 4 hours of lecture and interviews and stock full of resources. So when you're starting to see patients that are post-COVID and you're kind of running up against some walls or unsure about your screening, check that out. It's a pretty fast course. It is meant to be concise. And also, the next cohort of the primary care physical therapist is starting April 5th. So if you are game for that, jump into that cohort. We're starting soon. This last cohort was amazing. So if you're in that and listening to this, good job. That was a really fun crew. So today, I really wanted to talk about one of the many rheumatic diseases that affects our patients. Today, we're going to dive into psoriatic arthritis a little bit. This is somewhat inspired by the fact that I seem to be a magnet for these patients recently. And so I've done a lot more research on them in order to get better at my practice. And also just that I think there are a lot of pieces that are missing from our ability to treat some of these patients that are not necessarily just exercise oriented, but also just in terms of kind of being their primary point of care, or at least one of them. So today I want to talk about some of those points, and I even made myself a list so that I would not get off topic. So first of all, what is psoriatic arthritis? So this is an arthritic condition that is autoimmune, that is about 30% of people who have psoriasis. So psoriasis is like an overproduction via the keratinocytes. I might put an extra syllable in there, sorry. But basically creating more skin, and so you get this scaling, right, of the keratin. But that happens inside the body as well as outside of the body. So for this systemic inflammatory condition, patients who have psoriatic arthritis will also have joint pain, but they'll also have enthesitis. Enthesitis basically means an inflammatory effect to where the tendons junction with the bone, their bony attachment sites. So like the Achilles, plantar fascia, just any sort of tendinitis that we generally think of, these are really common attributes of psoriatic arthritis. Also elbows, like tricep tendinitis, is a really, really common one. So that affects these people. They will also commonly have dactylitis, which basically just means swelling of the fingers or the toes. And you can see this in a very painful fashion or even in a non-painful fashion. And that's something like 40% of people. So we want to think about this as a full systemic disease, not just affecting the joints, more like RA would, but also having these other attributes that we can think about if we're having potentially a patient who has, say, a bilateral tendinopathy that we've been treating and it's just not seeming to get better, but they've also got a history of certain things like family history of psoriatic arthritis, a lot of joint pain and swelling. Things are bilateral. It seems systemic. Now, a lot of these patients will come to your clinic with a diagnosis already. In fact, many people with psoriatic arthritis will end up in PT at one point or another. So even though the prevalence is fairly low in the population, about 0.25% of the population may have psoriatic arthritis. We still need to keep our guard up and understand this disease and how it affects our treatment, because those patients are definitely going to land in PT because some of their primary complaints and problems have to do with joint pain, tendon pain, inflammatory effect on the body systemically. Now, a lot of these patients will be medically managed, or they should be, right? So generally what they do is they start with a drug category called DMARDs, a really clever little acronym that stands for Disease Modifying Anti-Rheumatic Drug. So the most common one that they'll start with for people is called methotrexate. And they'll generally give this a 6 to 12-month trial till it builds up in the system and starts to control that overinflamed body systemically, basically. When those don't work, because most patients with psoriatic arthritis will kind of graduate through drugs, like their body gets too used to them, so they have to move them onto a different one. They will then end up on a biologic. Many of those you've heard of. There are things like Humira and Enbrel. And so they'll kind of go through those and see which one of those help to kind of control a patient's symptoms most appropriately. Now, another thing we need to be aware of with this population is that a good percentage of them have cardiovascular disease. So if you think about it, right, like their body is systemically inflamed. Their joints have overinflammation going on, their tendons do. So it doesn't just stay in those tissues, if only it would. But whenever you have a systemic inflammation going on, and this is very similar to obesity even, you still have that overtaxation of the heart and the cardiovascular system. So people with psoriatic arthritis, of no fault of their own, may often have underlying cardiovascular disease. So we are thinking vitals people, we've got to be looking at blood pressure and heart rate and respiratory rate and seeing how all of those things are affected by activity and exercise. Because sometimes, you think about their primary care physician or their rheumatologist is treating all these things, and they're thinking like the tendons and the joints and all these other aspects, if they're not also screening for development of cardiovascular disease, of which these people have a much higher prevalence, that's a big piece that could get missed and really affect how these people feel. So we need to be sure that we're stepping up to the plate and doing some screening to kind of help out with patients who have psoriatic arthritis. Now, what about exercise, right? Because in the literature, there is very little to guide us here. There's basically the idea that people with psoriatic arthritis should exercise, need to be strong, need to be flexible, that it helps to prevent, further deterioration, which as physical therapists, we all know that makes sense. But how do we do that? And I'll tell you, it's not consistently true or the same or generic for every patient. So basically what I want to kind of update you on today are some of the things that worked for me and for my recent patients, just so that if these patients show up with you, you have a better idea of kind of some things to try, because truly there isn't a whole lot of guidance aside from they need to be stronger and cardiovascularly fit. Yay. So number one, low impact cardiovascular exercise is very, very helpful. Now, if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense, right? You've got this systemic inflammatory effect that's building up in joint spaces, along tendons, in all those spots. Wouldn't it help just to have like that little bit of cardiovascular exercise to sort of use muscular pumping, increase the cardiovascular system's return, get lymphatic system working just a little bit better so that that inflammation is at a lower level? Absolutely. So this could be walking for patients who can tolerate it. This could be cycling. This could be swimming. I cannot wait for pools to be totally open so I can send some of these patients to the pool. But something along those lines. And it doesn't have to be one thing specifically, just something to kind of get that inflammatory effect recirculating. One thing that I found helpful for one of the patients I'm treating right now is if he warms up on a bike and then does some strength stuff and then cools down on a bike, it really helps decrease how sore or how inflamed his joints can become from exercise. And I really think it's just warming the system up, getting things moving, do your lifting, your things that create more inflammation in the tissue in order to reformulate muscle, bones, etc. And then pump it out. Do your cool down with some cardio to get any of that inflammation that is more static and stagnant out of the body or getting recirculated. So that's something that has really worked well for some of my patients. Now, with manual therapies, I just want to say they can be very helpful, but also they're not always appropriate. I know that's really straightforward, right? Here's the thing. For patients, depending on where in the spectrum they are in terms of control, like medically controlled psoriatic arthritis, their bodies may still become very easily inflamed from stress. Now, if you think about it, a lot of the manual therapies we use in relationship to a tendinitis, not necessarily an enthesitis, but a tendinitis, right, are things that are manual therapy, cupping, scraping, tool work, all that sort of stuff. And that's great. And it might be tolerated by these patients just fine. But I think when we're using manual therapies with this patient population, we need to educate them and be really straightforward about the fact that it might create extra inflammation that might make them more sore. And it's possible that this will help a lot. And it's possible that it's just not the right time. And the reason we really need to do that is because if we don't educate beforehand and the patient leaves and they're more sore, more inflamed, because we created this inflammatory response, which is part of the goal, but also in someone's body who's already overly inflamed, it may take that treatment off the table for forever for us. If we educate them that it may help and it may not help, but we need to just test it out and we may come back to it later if this is not the right time, then we haven't necessarily blown it if it doesn't work this time. We may get to use that technique later in time and space, but we have to prep it correctly. And we've got to think about it like that and not just like, well, this patient isn't responding to my PT. It's like, no, it just might not be responding right now because of the underlying systemic thing going on in the body. Not because the patient did something wrong, not because you did something wrong, but because that body is programmed a little bit differently. So just consider that. Now, for this patient population, education is probably one of the primary things that I do. With one of the patients that I'm seeing, we sit and talk for an hour each time. We do almost nothing else. You know, we talk about exercise, we talk about movement, we talk about theory behind movement in orthopedics and about psoriatic arthritis. But mostly we just educate. Like I just educate and we talk through stuff because that's his personality. But it's made me realize how important the aspects of global health are for this population, right? When you have an autoimmune disease, and especially for a lot of these people, they tend to be diagnosed in their like low to mid 30s. This can be a lot to mentally handle. So it's good for us to be able to sit and talk with these people and let them know a little bit more than here's this one exercise you can do for this one part of your body that hurts, but more here's how you can treat your whole body. Just thinking about things like sleep quality, nutrition, being aware of monitoring their symptoms so that they can see if they do have common triggers for their flares or noticing any kind of pattern about their symptoms. Also, I think like for a lot of these people, if you see that they are struggling a little bit with this diagnosis, because remember, if you're like 31 and someone tells you you have an autoimmune disease that will affect you for the rest of your life, and impact your ability to move and be active and feel healthy, that's a big blow, right? So a lot of these people really should be seeing counselors, having therapy beyond physical therapy, just to make sure that they're on the right path and kind of getting the support they need through this journey, let's call it, especially when they're first being medically managed and they're not yet riding the wave of that biologic. They don't feel the positive effects yet of being on methotrexate or whatever. It's important that they make sure like they have the support they need in all those categories. Now, here's another piece. Even if someone has psoriatic arthritis, don't blame every injury on the disease. And this is something that I think like it's easy to do as a PT, right? Like someone comes in and they're a known patient, they have psoriatic arthritis and they're like, ugh, my elbow, my shoulder, my Achilles, my whatever. And they're like, damn psoriatic arthritis. Maybe not in that voice, but we should definitely get on board and be like, of course, we hate this disease. But also, it's important to step back and not necessarily blame the disease all the time. Because while psoriatic arthritis can create inflammation or an over-response to stimulus, it's not always completely at fault. And it doesn't mean that it's just like out of our control and there's nothing we can do. A lot of these patients respond really, really well to strengthening as long as we go slow and do it in ways that don't flare them up and watch our techniques. Also, it's like people with psoriatic arthritis have very orthopedic injuries that are also due to weakness, how they move, like even just straight up biomechanical random stuff that we learned in PT school. And it's very easy to discount all the things that we have ever previously known or used about pain and about movement and about strength and flexibility because we're like, psoriatic arthritis, it's the disease's fault. And the disease may be at play, but it's probably not 100% of the problem going on. So we need to make sure as PTs that we're still addressing the 40% that's not psoriatic arthritis. We're still doing the things to unstress that tissue or stress it enough that it can reformulate whatever the theory is for the thing that's involved, but make sure that we're not just blaming it. This also gives the patient a little bit more power, right, in the situation where they feel pretty powerless anyway because they've got this disease that's just attacking their body. So to make sure they understand that there are things they can do and that it's not always just that the disease is random and uncontrollable. It's just that it's going to make their body's response significantly greater. And when they're being medically managed, so their disease is being controlled by biologic or DMARD, this should be significantly less. They should be able to do things in a fairly normal way without flare-ups, but depending on where in the course of the disease they are, this can change. So we just need to be really aware of our own bias and also appreciative of the fact that if we educate our patients on what parts they can control, they will also feel better within the situation. Now, that said, there also may be times where exercise or PT in the standard issue variety is not helpful. And I think that that is something that we need to just be aware of as PTs. Like we as therapists, physical therapists, are important no matter what because we can do education, we can do physical stuff, we can talk exercise, we can talk activity programming, we can think about energy management strategies. There are all sorts of things that we can do, but I just want to put out there, if a patient is in a flare-up, it may not be the day to do that exercise program that you envisioned for them. It may not be the day to get out your Graston or Aston tools or whatever you like to use. It may be a day to sit and chat, to talk about strategies, to talk about stepping back the program until the flare goes away. And I think it's important that we make sure that our patients understand that our strategies throughout our relationship with them are going to change and that that's okay because we're always going to be modifying based on their body's response. But it also means we can't just fall into those patterns of here's your 5 exercises and we're progressing them because we believe in the overload principle, which we do, but we have to be really, really aware for these patients of not doing too much in that way, of not going too fast, of being sure we're watching for their systemic reaction to what's going on, not just the knee pain, not just the ankle pain, the Achilles pain, that sort of a thing. So be aware of that kind of strategy and educate your patients that it's going to change over time and that that's totally okay. The other thing is, and I tell patients this too, sometimes we're going to know why the flare-up occurred. And we'll be able to, be detectives and solve the mystery and figure out it was because you bundled this and this and this activity on a day where you also ate a food that generally your body doesn't like a whole lot and you had poor sleep quality. Aha, we know. And there are going to be times where you have no idea and you can't figure it out. And I think educating patients early that that's going to happen and that that is okay will help to kind of mitigate some of that fear and anger response when they do have flare-ups or when you can't figure it out and you don't have to be dishonest about it. So those are some of the strategies and principles I've been using with patients with psoriatic arthritis. And I'll tell you, I'm not 100% effective here either. When you have someone with an autoimmune disease, you can use theories, but I think the key piece is paying attention to your patient and just making sure that you are never settling for what you did last time, because their body is always going to be changing and there's no way for you to necessarily see into the future with your crystal ball on this one. So just make sure you're still paying attention, always reevaluating the situation and being empathetic towards your patients because this is a hard one to deal with. So hope that helped. Remember, with psoriatic arthritis, start low, go slow. Just keep the rhythm nice and smooth. The song of the day today, because of start low, go slow, is Slow Down by India Ari. So check that out if you've never heard it. It's a throwback from like the early 2000s. All right, people, have a great day. If you have any questions on patients with psoriatic arthritis, feel free to post them in the comments on Facebook and I will reply as able. Okay, happy Tuesday, y'all.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.